right. Good afternoon. Wasn't sure how many would be able to make it after school. Let me get the camera going. All right, so I have a recording already. All right, so today is the lesson on learning. So we looked at 3 different types of learning in this unit. We looked at classical conditioning, we looked at operant conditioning, and we looked at observational learning. So all of these types of learning are referred to as associative learning. So associative learning is simply learning to connect events, learning by association. So, for example, you see rain clouds in the morning when you get up. You anticipate that it's going to rain, so you might take a raincoat or an umbrella as a result of that. This making associations, this is as simple as you walking past a dog and you anticipate that the dog will bark. So all of the 3 different types of learning that we covered in this unit, classical, operant, and observational, they are all forms of associative learning. All right, so we're going to start off with classical conditioning first. Classical conditioning was actually coined by a Russian physiologist, so he wasn't a psychologist, who made his discovery accidentally. So Ivan Pavlov was working in a lab, and he was studying the digestive enzymes in dogs. Sounds kind of boring, but to study the enzymes, he needed saliva. So what would you use to get a dog to, or any animal to salivate? You would present them with food. If a dog sees or smells food, it's going to cause the dog to salivate. So he had test tubes in the salivary glands here where he would collect the saliva samples to test the enzymes. But after a few days of bringing in the dog food and collecting his sample of saliva, he noticed something unusual. Without even seeing the food or smelling the food, the test tube was full. So, in other words, when Pavlov came in, maybe 4 or 5 days later, after repeatedly every day bringing the dog food to get his saliva samples, so like on the 4th or 5th day, he walks in and just hearing his footsteps, but not seeing any food, the dog salivated. So Pavlov wondered, could the dog have learned to make the connection between my footsteps and the fact that food was coming? So he made that association and would start salivating just by hearing Pavlov's shoes or Pavlov walking in. All right, so I'm going to go over the different parts of classical conditioning. So we looked at, first of all, before conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus. Now, a stimulus is something that affects your senses, something that you're experiencing, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, or smelling. So that's a sensation, unconditioned stimulus. Okay, before conditioning, he used the food, caused the unconditioned response, the natural response to that stimulus. So I like to think of unconditioned as unlearned. It happens naturally. So the unconditioned stimulus, the food, caused the dog to salivate naturally, the unconditioned or naturally occurring response. Okay. Also, before conditioning, he took something neutral. Here you see a tuning fork. A lot of people talk about he used a bell. So before conditioning, that would be neutral. The dog would just sit and look at it, right? It doesn't have any effect if you ring a bell. All right, then during the conditioning process, what he did every day, he would come in, take the neutral stimulus. So let's say a bell. He would ring the bell, present the dog food, the dog would salivate. This is the conditioning process, teaching the dog to make the connection between the bell and the food. So after doing this for so many days, he doesn't even have to present the food. He simply walks in, rings the bell, and the dog salivates. So now the bell, after conditioning takes place, becomes the conditioned or learned response, causing salivating to the bell, the conditioned stimulus. So you'll see scenarios where you'll be asked, is it an unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned response? Think about the fact when you look at the scenario, if it happens naturally and you don't have to be taught, it's unconditioned. If it's something that would have to be taught, that's conditioned. If it's a stimulus, it's something that affects your senses. Response is the response to that particular stimulus. All right, so I gave you the actual descriptions of what I was just talking about. All right, here's the example that they used in the book, which I thought was kind of humorous. So you have the unconditioned stimulus, a passionate kiss, okay, causing the natural response of romantic arousal. So that's the unconditioned response. Happens naturally. You kiss someone, you're sexually aroused. All right, so you pair something neutral like onion breath. Normally, onion breath does not cause romantic arousal or have any effect. It's neutral. But by pairing onion breath with the passionate kiss over and over and over again, the person learns to make that connection during that conditioning process. After conditioning takes place, after the learning takes place, then smelling onion breath, because they made the association with the passionate kiss, would cause the romantic arousal. So that's not natural. That's something that had to be taught. The onion breath then becomes the conditioned stimulus, and romantic arousal to the onion breath is the conditioned or learned response. And in class, I gave an example of water in the face. So I usually ask for a volunteer to come up, and I let them know ahead of time, I'm going to spray you with water. So, usually it's a guy that agrees. So anyway, I start reading it off of a card, and I say things like, a clown's nose is red. And when I say the word red, I spray the person with water in the face. The colors of the American flag are blue, white, and red. I keep going through a series of that. So after about 6 phrases, then I say, when I'm angry, I see, and I don't spray, but the person flinches. Because if you spray somebody in the face, they're naturally going to flinch. Okay, if you spray someone with water. So in that example, the unconditioned stimulus would be the water in the face, causing the person to flinch. That's the unconditioned response. Happens naturally. Everyone does that. Taking something neutral, like the word red. Normally, when someone hears the word red, they don't flinch. But by pairing that neutral word red with the water in the face, that's the conditioning process, that afterwards caused the student to flinch in response to the word red. So after conditioning, the word red becomes the conditioned or learned stimulus, and flinching to the word red causes the conditioned or learned response. All right, so I also told you in class about my daughter, my oldest daughter was extremely afraid of needles. So whenever you're going into pre-K, you have to get so many vaccines. And it seemed like every time we went, Nurse Becky was the nurse that had to give her shots. And she would thrash around, and it would take several nurses to actually hold her down. So anyway, we're in the market one day, and she's in the buggy facing me, and we're walking along, and all of a sudden she grabs my shirt and she starts going, no, no, no. And I turn around, and it's Nurse Becky. So she had learned to make a connection between getting a shot and Nurse Becky. So in that case, the unconditioned stimulus is the shot, causing the unconditioned, naturally occurring response of being fearful or crying in response to the injection. Taking something neutral, normally Becky doesn't cause children to be fearful, but pairing Becky with the shot over and over again after conditioning, Becky then became the conditioned or learned stimulus, causing the conditioned or learned response of fearing Becky. And I showed you the example from the office. where Jen conditions Dwight. All right, a few other terms looking at classical conditioning. First of all, acquisition. That simply means this is the stage, the conditioning process. This is when you are acquiring, that's where acquisition comes from. You're acquiring the behavior. This is the training process. This is pairing the food with the bell. This is pairing the word red with the water in the face. There's Becky with the shot, the passionate kiss with onion breath. So it's that learning phase. Two things that you need to think about when you're using, you're in the conditioning process. The neutral stimulus must come first. So the bell needs to be rung before the dog gets food. If you walk in and you give the dog food and then you ring the bell afterwards, the dog is not making that connection. It's already got the food and it's salivating. And they should occur together. Okay, so for example, if you ring the bell, you can't wait 15 minutes to present the dog with food. They're not going to make that connection. They have to occur together. Now, it's not the same with people. We have cognitive ability, and we are able to recognize that two things go together, even if they're not at the same time. For example, if you go to McDonald's and you eat a chicken sandwich that's bad and you get food poisoning and you're vomiting 30 minutes later, you'll still make the connection. But with animals, it should come together. All right, extinction can occur. And this happens if you continually just present the conditioned stimulus, okay, and never give the dog that unconditioned stimulus again. So, for example, if I walk in after I've trained a dog to salivate to a bell, and I walk in every day for 2 weeks and ring a bell, and I do not give the dog food, the counter conditioning is going to take place. The dog's going to be like, well, you're ringing that bell, but there's nothing with it. So the dog will stop salivating. So if you wanted to continue with the behavior, you'd have to throw that food in every now and then. You'd have to add in the unconditioned stimulus. All right, two more terms. First one, generalization. So generalization would be responding to similar stimuli. So not only responding to the bell, but anything that sounded the same. So maybe a beep, a buzzer, a gong, anything that was similar to the bell. That's generalizing. Discrimination, you only respond to that particular stimulus. So, for example, the dog would only respond to the sound of that bell and nothing else. Every once in a while, even after a behavior becomes extinct, it can just show up randomly. So let's say a dog quit salivating to the bell, but yet 2 years later, it heard a bell and it salivated again. That's spontaneous recovery. All right, so Pavlov used classical conditioning on animals. The founder of behaviorism, John Watson, in the 1920s, decided that he was going to try and use classical conditioning on humans. So he did his study. He was professor at Johns Hopkins. So he and his assistant here, Rosalie Rayner, they did what was known as and been called the Baby Albert experiment. So they went, according to his research, went to a local orphanage and picked up a young baby around 9 months of age. He called the baby Albert to conceal his identity, not using his real name. So during his research or his experiment, he wanted to create fear in a young child. He wanted the child to learn fear of animals. You know, babies aren't naturally fearful of things. And he shows before conditioning that the child was perfectly comfortable with looking at and touching animals. He brings in a dog, he brings in a bunny, he even shows him fire. You know, he brings in a rat or a mouse and a monkey. He brings in all these different animals, and the child has no fear whatsoever. So that's before conditioning. All right, so during the conditioning process, and this is very unethical, you could never do this today, but it was the 1920s. We did not have ethical guidelines for research. So during the conditioning process, which he didn't film, thank goodness, he had this big bar beside the child's ear, and every time he brought in an animal, they would bang on that bar, causing the child to cry and be upset. So that was the conditioning process over and over and over again. So you're causing a lot of stress and fear in this child every time you show them the animal. So after a couple of weeks, you no longer had to beat on the bar. Just bringing in an animal, you can see the fear in the child. The child would try to crawl away from the animal and cry. So in his experiment, the unconditioned stimulus, okay, that would be beating on that bar, naturally caused the child to cry and get upset and be stressed. So taking something neutral like an animal didn't really have any effect on the child beforehand. So taking something neutral like an animal and pairing it with that loud noise, after conditioning, the animal became the conditioned stimulus, the learned stimulus, causing the learned or conditioned response of being fearful and crying and feeling stressed when they saw the animal. Now, eventually, Watson and Rayner were dismissed from Johns Hopkins, but it wasn't for their torturing of young baby Albert, but they were caught having an affair. And that was very taboo in the 1920s. Psychologists have been very curious over the years trying to figure out the identity of baby Albert to see if there was any lasting effects from the experiment. Unfortunately, he died when he was in 9 years old, I believe. His name was Douglas Malott, and his mother was actually a nurse at Johns Hopkins and was given $1 a day for her child to participate in that. He died of encephalitis or some sort of meningitis. So I'm doing my AP review. I'm going to pause. All right, so that finishes off the part of classical conditioning. Let me pull up operant conditioning next. All right, so operant conditioning, we are looking at reward and punishment, reinforcement and punishment. So operant conditioning is based on the fact that if you reward somebody or reinforce them for doing something, you give them something, the behavior is likely to continue. So the behavior will increase or strengthen. On the other hand, if you punish someone for doing something, the behavior is likely to decrease or stop. All right, so that is a principle that was created by E.L. Thorndike. He called this the law of effect. Again, you only see two laws in psychology, and this is one of them, Weber's law and the law of effect. And it's because it applies to the majority. Most people, if you reward them or give them a reinforcement, they will do what you ask. The behavior will increase or strengthen. On the other hand, most people, if you punish them for doing something, then the behavior is likely to decrease. So although Thorndike came up with this law of effect, it was B.F. Skinner down here who elaborated on his law of effect, and he called this type of conditioning operant conditioning. So here's Skinner down here. He used pigeons, he used rats. I told you in class, he used pigeons and he taught them to play like air hockey. They had like a little table with a little slat on either side and a puck in the middle. And they would use their beaks to push the puck along. And if they got their puck in their opponent's slat, then they had food drop down in a dispenser. That was their reinforcement. Anytime you train an animal, you're using operant conditioning. For example, if you're teaching a dog to sit, every time you push them down, you say sit, sit. And when they do it, you pet them or you give them a treat. Okay, you're giving them a reinforcement or a reward, and in return, they engage in that behavior. So that is operant conditioning. So looking at operant conditioning, this is his box that he used. This one would have been for the rats or the mice that he used, the Skinner box, or sometimes called the operant chamber. All right, so again, a reinforcer is something that strengthens or increases behavior. And we looked at two different types, positive and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, this is adding something pleasant. So with positive and negative, you're either adding something or taking something away. So you're adding something pleasant to get someone to do something for you. So you might say to a child, if you go clean your room, I'll give you some ice cream. Or if you do well on your report card, I'll give you some money. So you're adding something pleasant to get someone to do something. Negative reinforcement, you're taking something unpleasant away, again, to strengthen the behavior, get someone to do something for you. So you might say to your child, if you clean your room or if you get good grades, I'll take away those unwanted chores for the next 9 weeks that you have to do. A coach might say, if you win on Friday night, I'll take away the unwanted Saturday morning practice. All right, so here's a couple examples. So first of all, putting on your seatbelt to get rid of the nagging buzzer. Okay, that would be negative. You're doing it to get rid of something unpleasant. Okay, you're taking away the buzzing sound. Faking sick to avoid AP Psych class. So you're faking sick so you don't have to go to the unwanted class. So that's negative. You're studying to avoid a bad grade. Okay, you're doing something to avoid something unpleasant. So again, negative. Taking an aspirin for a headache. Okay, you're not taking it because you like it. You're doing it. You're taking the aspirin to get rid of something unpleasant, to get rid of that headache. So again, that's negative. Getting a kiss for doing the dishes, that's the only one that's positive. So you're adding something pleasant for doing something for that kiss. All right, a few schedules of reinforcement. So first of all, fixed ratio. So fixed is set. Okay, ratio is number. So you're being rewarded or reinforced after a set number. So anybody who is a salesman or cuts lawns, they're likely operating under a fixed ratio. They get paid for every car that they sell. They get a commission. You get paid for each lawn that you cut. In this example, someone's on a diet, so she gets a manicure for every 5 pounds she loses. That's her reward. All right, so fixed interval comes next. So again, this is set, but interval means time. So a good example here, you get a bi-weekly paycheck. You get paid every other Wednesday. So every 2 weeks you get paid. So that's set amount of time. Okay, so if you're on a diet, that example, fixed interval, instead of for every 5 pounds, you're looking at time. So you get a manicure for every week that you stay on your diet. All right, so variable ratio. Again, ratio is number, but variable is unpredictable. So after an unpredictable number, you will get rewarded or reinforced. And a good example here is the slot machine. That's typically the question on an AP test. So you sit down to slot machine. It's unpredictable how many times you're going to push that button before that machine pays out. It's very addictive schedule of reinforcement. Same with fishing. You don't know how many times you're going to have to cast that line before you actually get rewarded and catch a fish. And variable interval. Okay, this is an unpredictable amount of time. Pop quizzes would be an example. An unpredictable amount of time can go by before your teacher gives you a pop quiz. I like waiting for a taxi cab. So if you're on a busy street corner, it's unpredictable how long you'll have to stand there until a cab stops and picks you up. All right, so punishment. Again, punishment is intended to decrease or stop a behavior. And here we have positive and negative punishment, but don't think of good or bad. It's adding to or taking something away. So positive punishment is the addition of something unpleasant now. So you're adding something someone doesn't like. So if your child is being disrespectful, you can smack them on the butt or scold them. You're adding something unpleasant to get them to stop. If you're speeding, you might get a ticket. Okay, so that's adding something unpleasant, that awful fine. Okay, so negative punishment, you're taking away something they like. You're taking away something pleasant. So, for example, if your child is disrespectful, you could take away a favorite toy or their cell phone. If you get too many tickets, you may have your license revoked. So that would be negative punishment. You're taking something you like away. And punishment works best when it's immediate, right after the event. All right, anytime you're using a reward or punishment, it has to be important to the person. If it's something that they don't care about, it's not going to work. So for example, if I promised my 16-year-old, if you get A's and B's on your report card, I'll give you a sticker. They're not going to care. A kindergartner might, but a 16-year-old will not. So that's the Premack principle. The reinforcement and also the punishment has to be important for it to work. All right, we looked at token economy, which is a behavior modification. So this is used to where you give someone a token or a symbol for appropriate behavior. And after they accumulate so many, they can trade them in for a prize. And I gave you the example of the treasure box in kindergarten. Monday through Thursday, if a student acts appropriate, they get a symbol and they can trade those symbols in on Friday to pick out of the treasure box. Shaping. Shaping is a form of operant conditioning. You're rewarding individuals for their behavior, but you're doing it in small steps, guiding them to their big goal. So let's say that you're trying to teach your child how to write their name. Instead of waiting until they write their full name, you give them a little reward for each letter. Okay, you're shaping them, you're guiding them to that goal. All right, so that is everything with operant conditioning. And the next thing we're going to look at is observational learning. All right, so learning by observing. It is so easy to watch somebody perform a task and then repeat it. We are really good at modeling behavior, imitating others. I think about some things that I've done, like I helped put in a counter in my kitchen. And I was able to do that because of a YouTube video, watching it. Okay, whenever I read directions, I would never, ever have been able to do that. I made sushi one time. I used a printed recipe. And I thought I followed it correctly, but the sushi turned out just like, it didn't taste bad, but the presentation wasn't very nice. It looked like a blob. And I was like, I don't know what I did wrong. So then I watched a YouTube video. I'm like, oh, that's what I did wrong. And then I was able to do it. It's very difficult to get verbal directions in many cases and try and do something, but watching, it makes it so much easier. And it's because every time we learn a task or perform a task, we create a neural network, a neural pathway in our brain. And every time we perform that task over and over again, it becomes easier and easier and easier, and it can become like automatic. Think of the first time you learned to tie your shoes when you were 3, 4, and well, think about how difficult that would have been if you were just told what to do. Here's 2 strings, take one, wrap them around another loop and pull between. Nobody would ever know how to tie their shoes. But watching it, you were able to do it. But that took a lot of focus and concentration when you're 4 years old learning how to tie your shoes. Now, you've done that so many times throughout your life, that neural connection, that pathway in your brain is so very strong that it's just automatic. You don't even think about it. So the more you perform a task or think about something, the same is true for whenever you learn a definition or you're focused on some term you need to know for a test. The more you look at it, the more you focus on it, the more readily it'll come to your mind and be able to recall it when need be. But that's why coaches say practice makes perfect. That's absolutely right. The more you perform a task, the more automatic it becomes. So with that said, we have what are called mirror neurons in our brain. Pull that up there. So what's interesting is whenever we perform a task, that neural pathway becomes active and it strengthens. But when we watch someone else perform that same task, the same neural pathway in our brains light up and become active, and we can experience that. This is the reason that we feel empathy for others. So, for example, if I see someone tying their shoe, that pathway in my brain is actually active, and I can experience that. Now, this holds true with emotions also. So we've all experienced happiness. We've all experienced sadness. So we have neural connections in our brain that are pretty strong for these emotions. So when we see others crying or we see others that are really happy, those same pathways are activated and we start feeling that way. It's hard to watch a movie where you see people crying without wanting to cry yourself. They make you feel sad because that pathway is actually activated as well. So they are mirror neurons. And that's why it's so easy to model behavior, imitate behavior that we observe. All right, so in this unit, the researcher you want to associate with observational learning is Albert Bandura. Albert Bandura was concerned with modeling behavior in children. So his research took place in the early 1960s, 1961. And the date's important because this is around the time that most American households had a television. They were first released and invented and available to the public in the 50s. So by 1961, most Americans had one. And on television, a lot of the shows, the Westerns, and the police shows, things like that, were kind of violent in nature. There's no TV rating at the time. So he was curious, how this would impact young children. Would children, if they're exposed to aggression or violent behavior, would they model that behavior also? So he did the Bobo doll experiment. And a Bobo doll is a big inflatable clown that if you punch it, it goes over and comes right back up. So he took young children, split them into 2 groups. One group saw a woman beating on a Bobo doll. That's pretty much what she did the whole time she's in this room full of toys. And the other group saw the woman just in the room, walking around, looking at the toys, reading a book, doing, non-aggressive things. So he was curious. The first group, let's call them Group A, they watched the aggression. If they were allowed to go in and into the playroom, would they focus on the toys or would they model that aggression and beat up the doll? Well, his prediction was they probably would, and he was right. The children who watched the aggressive acts were very aggressive towards the Bobo doll and kind of ignored the toys, even using the toys as weapons. Whereas the other children in the group who did not see the aggressive acts, they did not engage in that aggressive behavior. And who can resist punching a clown? I'm sure most of them did that, but they didn't just focus on the clown. They went around and actually played with toys. So he did see that, it's really sad. Young children are vulnerable and will imitate behavior. So they need to have somebody explain to them that aggressive behavior, if they've witnessed it, is not appropriate. Recent research has looked at violent video games as well, and children who watch like wrestling and violent video games, play violent video games, watch aggressive shows, tend to get more behavior referrals in school, get in more trouble, and are more aggressive. Studies have also shown they have an overactive amygdalas, which is your anger center in your brain. The good thing is, if the following holds true as well. If you are a positive role model, if you're doing good things, then the children will model that helpful and that positive behavior as well. Pro-social behavior. All right, 2 final terms. First of all, latent learning. This is learning that you didn't try to learn this task, and it really isn't. You don't realize that you've learned it until you're asked to perform it. So, for example, you may have been riding around. This happened to me when I was a teenager. My mother, after I got my license, she wanted me to go get something down at the post office in Cumberland for her. I'm like, I don't know how to get there. I was kind of afraid driving on all the different one-way streets in Cumberland. I'm like, I don't know. I don't have any idea how to get there. And she's like, you rode with me so many times down there. Just go. You'll remember. You do know it. Sure enough, she was right. So that's something I had observed over and over and over again. Never tried to learn it. But after I was asked to actually do that, I realized I did know it. So that's a latent learning. I think it comes later. A cognitive map is just a mental image or representation of your surroundings. So whenever you go off to college, if you go to a big college, you'll first want to look at a map of all of the different buildings in your dorm and how to navigate around. So you get that mental image, and it allows you, that observation allows you to navigate your environment much, much easier. All right, so that's everything for learning. Again, I recommend that if you're on now, you go home and you try to answer some of the practice questions in the book. And if you have any questions, you can ask me, send me a message, or ask me in class tomorrow. All right, I hope you all have a good afternoon, and I will see you all tomorrow.